So I've finally gotten around to making a slideshow for my custom Wii U CPU Me difficulty levels in Wii Party U. So So for the beginner me's, I have Adam, Anahira, Blossom, Botan, Cam, Canvas, Egypt, Fadi, who is my least favorite, Jan, who is a mix of Michelle Magnuson's me, Hans, and Zekai, Jalong, who is inspired by Corey and Nick, Gian Park, who is inspired by Alice, Komala, who's a mix of Hiromi from the Wii and Patricia, Komorebi, who's inspired by Mia from Wii Music, Laren, Piper, Raiden, Rashad, Siri, who's inspired by Eva, Tato, and Valenzuela. In standard, I have Alicia, Anemone, Osk, who is inspired by Paul from Brawl for the Mini DVD player, although he's nowhere near as annoying as Paul. Bo, Candace, who is inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Scarlet. Dolores, Elena, Enrique, who's a mix of Hyunwoo and Pablo. Hertz, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Juan. Joanna, Kimani, Kyoya, Matt, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me of himself, Nico, Noi, Pushta, Kismat, who's inspired by Xiaoxian, Siran, who's inspired by Merrick, Terhas, and Shuifeng. In advanced, I have Aaliyah, Aquamarine, who's inspired by Chica, Bede, Brend, Connery, Forrest, Hennessy, Jazara, Kim, Kyler, Layla, Nezumi, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Genesis, Nguyen, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Roy, Chi, Rafiki, who is a mix of Marias and Tatsuaki, Ushi, Vincenzo, Wolfgang, who's inspired by Tyrone, Xiao Shang, and Xiao Tong, who's inspired by Naomi. For expert, I have Belcalis, Brian, Dunbar, Fabio, Gabrielle, Goyo, Honore, who's a mix of Millie and Takashi, June, Christian, who's inspired by anime Katrina 2021's me of herself, Kumi, who's inspired by Leone, Linda, who's inspired by Union, Madoka, Morgan, Oscar, Pietro, Quinn, who's inspired by Wii U, Hiromi, Tempera, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Hana, Valentine, who's inspired by Sam Sports Resort's me of himself, Xiao, and Ziazan, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Marnie. And for Master, I have Alexandru, who's a mix of Crispin from Brawl for the Mini DVD player and Eddie, Bjork, Bruno, who's inspired by Vincenzo, Katrina, Kira, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Shioki, and is also my favorite of my Wii U Mi's, Ferran, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Caesar, Francesca, Gitanjali, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Serenity, Ivan, who's inspired by Yost, Ivo, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Nolan, Hakis, Giu, Kiki, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Nayeli, Miko, Patricia, who's inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Kumi, Ren Xiang, who's inspired by Wii U, Barbara, Sarah, who's inspired by Jack Jealous's me, Doi, Sinead, who's inspired by JD Desi's me, Stefan, Shivna, who's inspired by Wii Barbara, and Zanti, who is inspired by Michelle Magnuson's me, Yuki. And yeah, what was your favorite and least favorite me of each difficulty? Please let me know in the comments.